Hello everyone and welcome to our module on epithelial cells. Epithelial cells are cells that form the tissue layer called the epithelium. This is the layer of cells that lines cavities and surfaces throughout the body. So for example, you can find epithelial cells in the skin, you can find them in the lung lining the airways, you can find them in the GI tract lining the bowel. These cells also secrete substances. In some cases, they form the endocrine and exocrine glands of the body, and they're one type of the four major types of animal tissue. One type is the epithelium, the other three types are muscle tissue, nerve tissue, and connective tissue. Closely related to epithelial cells is a structure called the basement membrane. As the name implies, this is a membrane that's found underneath or in the basement of layers of epithelial cells. It's made up of proteins. It's a fibrous extracellular matrix, meaning a whole bunch of proteins linked together, and its job is to anchor epithelial cells to the connective tissue, as I've shown in this picture. So for example, if you have connective tissue under the skin, you might find a basement membrane linked to that connective tissue, which in turn links to the epithelial cells, which may be layered in the skin. Technically, the basement membrane is made up of two layers. The first layer is called the basal lamina. This is a collection of extracellular matrix proteins that are secreted by epithelial cells, and it sits right beneath the epithelial cells. One of the major protein structures found in the basal lamina is laminin, and that's easy to remember because the names sound alike. In addition, you can find lots of type 4 collagen in the basal lamina, and it's high yield to remember this because there are a number of diseases where type 4 collagen is abnormal, and that's what causes the disease. So for example, in the videos in the renal section on the nephritic syndrome, I talk about Goodpasture syndrome and Alport syndrome, and these are both related to abnormalities of type 4 collagen found in the basal lamina of the basement membrane. The other layer of the basement membrane is called the reticular lamina. It's also sometimes called the reticular connective tissue. The word reticular means like a net, and this is a net of connective tissue that anchors the basal lamina to the underlying connective tissue beneath the basement membrane. Now let's talk about cell polarity. So in the body, sheets of epithelial cells tend to bind together, as I've drawn on the screen here. So you may have a number of epithelial cells sitting next to each other. And it turns out in many cases, what happens on one side of the cell is different from what happens on the other side of the cell. This is called cell polarization, meaning that different membrane surfaces of the cell do different functions, and not all membranes of the cell are the same. The side of the epithelial cell that is facing a cavity or a lumen in the body is called the apical membrane. So for example, if you look at my drawing on the bottom of the screen here, we've got a basement membrane and four epithelial cells sitting next to each other. If this is the lumen of a blood vessel here, or the lumen of the GI tract, or the lumen of a nephron, or the outside of the body in the case of the skin, we would call this side of the epithelial cells the apical membrane. The side that is away from the cavity or lumen, the side that faces the basement membrane, is called the basolateral membrane. You just need to know that terminology. And if you've watched our videos on the nephron in the renal section, in those videos I talk about tubular epithelial cells. These are epithelial cells that line the tubules of the nephron, and these cells are highly polarized. The side that faces the lumen, where the urine is called the apical side. The side that faces the interstitium or blood, which is towards the basement membrane, is called the basolateral side. And as you know, if you've watched those videos on the nephron, there are different pumps found on the different sides of the cell. So we've talked about how epithelial cells sit on top of a basement membrane. We've also talked about how they often sit next to each other in sheets. Now let's talk about how those cells are joined together. If you have two epithelial cells sitting next to each other, they will be joined together by structures that are naturally called epithelial cell junctions. These join the plasma membrane of adjacent cells. And there are four traditional types of epithelial cell junctions: the tight junctions, the adherens, the gap junctions, and the desmosomes. There's a drawing of them on the screen here, and we'll go through each of these one at a time in the next few slides. First, let's talk about the tight junctions. These are sometimes called occluding junctions. They are also sometimes said to make up what is known as the zonula occludens. And what tight junctions do is they seal two cell membranes together, just like is shown in this picture on the screen. So if this is one cell here and this is another one on the bottom, their two cell membranes are next to one another, and the tight junction is going to seal those two membranes together. And these junctions are so tight, that's why they're called tight junctions, that they serve as a barrier to paracellular movement between the cells. In other words, nothing could pass between these two cells if there is a tight junction present. These types of junctions tend to be found near the apical membrane. So if you look at my drawing at the bottom of the screen, this is the basement membrane, this is the apical side of the cells, and this is where you tend to find these tight junctions. They are usually the most apical adhesion between two cells. And the proteins that are used to make up tight junctions go by names like occludins and claudins. There's nothing special you need to know about these except that they are the major components of the tight junction. Second type of connection between epithelial cells is called the adherens junctions. These are also sometimes called belt desmosomes, not to be confused with desmosomes that we'll talk about later. These are also sometimes said to make up the zonula adherens, which is a zone in which these junctions link two cells together. These types of junctions are usually found below the tight junctions. So if you look at my drawing on the screen here, we've got a basement membrane, we've got the apical side over here. The tight junctions tend to be the most apical junctions, and below those is where you tend to find the adherens junctions. They form a belt around the cells and they link the epithelial cells together. And one of the major proteins you find in these types of junctions is called cadherin. This is a cell membrane glycoprotein, and what it does is it attaches to actin filaments you find inside the cells. So let's look at this picture on the right side of the screen. We've got one epithelial cell here, we've got another one here, and they are going to be linked together by an adherens junction. There are actin filaments found inside of each of the epithelial cells, and the cadherins link those together so that the two epithelial cells are therefore joined. Most of the science of epithelial cell proteins and junctions does not have a lot of clinical relevance. This is mostly something that's important in the research world as people try to understand how cells link together. But I do want to point out one clinical correlation here, and that has to do with cadherin. So cadherin is a protein that gets its name because they are calcium-dependent adhesion proteins. That's where the word cad comes from. They're glycoproteins and there are many subtypes. The E-cadherin subtype is lost in some forms of breast cancer. And you can imagine that once this joining protein E-cadherin is lost, then the cells loosen their connections to each other, and that's one of the ways in which breast cancer cells are able to metastasize. And this is a clinical correlation, a clinical tie-in of the epithelial cell biology we're talking about in this video. Our next type of epithelial cell junction is the desmosome. This is sometimes called a spot desmosome or the macula adherens. And the reason it's called a spot desmosome is because these are little spots where two epithelial cells are linked together. So for example, if we were looking at the face of an epithelial cell, a desmosome is a little spot where it's linked to another epithelial cell. And this is different from the belts that we talked about before. So tight junctions and adherens junctions tend to form a belt all the way around the epithelial cell. In the case of desmosomes, you just have little spots where two cells are connected to one another. And these are very common in the skin. There are lots of desmosomes found in epithelial cells in the skin. The way that desmosomes attach two cells to one another is via intermediate filaments, which are found inside of epithelial cells. These intermediate filaments are proteins made up of keratin that are found in the cell cytoplasm, and in a desmosome, these intermediate filaments are linked by cadherins. To understand this better, let's look at this drawing on the screen here. So once again, imagine that we have an epithelial cell here, and we've got another one here, and they are linked together by a desmosome. Within each epithelial cell, you have these intermediate keratin filaments, and they are linked to one another by cadherin, which are the proteins that you find in desmosomes. And through this structure, the two cells are linked to one another at a spot on each of the membranes of the epithelial cells. Let's talk briefly about keratins. Keratins are tough, fibrous structural proteins. In the human body, you find them in hair cells and in skin cells. In other species, you find them in places where tough structures are needed, like horns of animals or claws or hooves. Keratin proteins are monomers that assemble into keratin filaments, which are a type of intermediate filament. In the video on the cytoskeleton in the cell biology section, I talk about different types of structures inside of cells. The smallest structures are the microfilaments, the largest are the microtubules, and the intermediate filaments, as their name implies, are in the middle. And keratin monomers assemble into keratin filaments, which are an example of intermediate filaments. So we talked about desmosomes and how those are spots where two epithelial cell membranes are joined together. A related structure is the hemidesmosome. These are similar to desmosomes, but instead of linking epithelial cell membranes together, they attach epithelial cells to the basement membrane. These hemidesmosomes contain intermediate filaments of keratin, just like desmosomes, but instead of linking the filaments through cadherins, like shown in this drawing here, they are linked by structures called integrins, which are also proteins. And as I said, they attach the epithelial cells to the basement membrane to structures like laminin in the basal lamina or collagen in the basement membrane. Our last type of epithelial cell junction is the gap junction. These are connections between two epithelial cells that have a channel to allow some molecules to pass between the two cells. The gap junctions are made up of protein molecules called connexins, and they form a structure called a connexon, and through this structure small molecules can pass. It's too small for large molecules like proteins and nucleic acids, but smaller molecules can pass. And in the videos on the action potential in the heart, I talk about how gap junctions are very important so that electrolytes like sodium can pass from one cell to another, and that's how depolarization spreads through myocytes. Here's a summary slide to help you remember everything we've talked about in terms of epithelial junctions. If you've got a polarized epithelial cell, it has an apical side, which is towards the lumen, and a basolateral side, which is away from the lumen towards the basement membrane. The most apical junctions tend to be the tight junctions. These are made up of proteins called claudins and occludins. Slightly away from the tight junctions in the apical side, closer to the basolateral side, you can find adherens junctions. Those are made up of cadherins. Then in some cells you can find desmosomes. Desmosomes are made up of cadherins and keratin intermediate filaments. And finally, some cells have gap junctions, which are made up of connexins. And then the hemidesmosomes are what connect epithelial cells to the basement membrane. They are also made up of keratin intermediate filaments and proteins called integrins. So using these connections that we've talked about, epithelial cells link together and form many structures inside the body. And you can read more about the different structures they form in your histology textbooks, but I've shown some examples of them here. So some epithelial cells link together and form simple squamous epithelium, which is a single layer. Some epithelial cells form cuboidal epithelium. There is columnar epithelium. There is pseudostratified columnar epithelium, and different organs and vessels in the body have different types of epithelial cell layers. Sometimes the epithelial cells pile one on top of another. This is called forming a stratified epithelium. So in some places in the body you can find stratified squamous epithelium, stratified cuboidal epithelium, and stratified columnar epithelium. And then there's a special type of epithelial layer called transitional epithelium. This is found largely in the urinary tract in places like the bladder and the urethra and the ureters. As I mentioned before, there isn't a lot of clinical relevance to the epithelial cell biology we've been talking about, but I do want to point out two skin disorders which I discuss in detail in a video on blistering disorders. Pemphigus vulgaris involves antibodies to desmosomes, which we talked about in this video, and bullous pemphigoid is a skin disorder that involves autoantibodies to hemidesmosomes, and this is one of the few clinical correlations of the epithelial cell biology we talked about in this video. And that concludes our video on